Well, beloveds, welcome back to this week's episode of the Abrahamic Family Narratives. We've had some real juicy episodes so far, so let's catch up. We began with the call of Abram and Sarai into the land that God will show them, and they leave home headed for Canaan. Abram and Sarai are promised children, but when that doesn't happen on their timetable, Abram has a child with Sarai's slave Hagar, and Ishmael is born. Abram and Sarai get renamed by God to Abraham and Sarah. And then Sarah is told by 3 strangers who came by to visit that she's going to have a son. Isaac is born. And Hagar and Ishmael are sent away, but saved in the wilderness by God. Yay! God then tells Abraham to give Isaac as a sacrifice. And right before Abraham kills Isaac, the angel of the Lord tells him to stop, and a ram is provided in his place. Yay! Thank you. So that's where we left off last week. And at the end of that account, there is a brief genealogy that includes the name of Rebekah. And then all of chapter 23 tells the story of the death of Abraham's wife and Isaac's mother, Sarah, and her burial. We're told she dies at 127. So today we meet Rebekah, a strong and courageous young woman. So chapter 24, where our text for today comes from, it's a long narrative. Not only is the story told twice in this chapter, once in the narration of the actual encounter at the well, and then a second time as the servant retells the whole story, like literally it happens, and then the servant is like, here's what happened. And we're like, yes, we're with you for all of that. But we also linger on all kinds of details until mercifully the whole thing ends after a whopping 67 verses, making this the longest chapter in Genesis and one of the longest in the whole Bible. So let's start from the beginning and read the whole thing. I'm going to give you all the Cliff Notes version. So it begins by Abraham sending his oldest and most trusted servant, never named, out to find a wife for Isaac. They make the ancient equivalent to the pinky promise, and that the servant will go back to their home country and find Isaac a wife. So the servant takes with him camels and lots of presents. And when they get to Nahor, they stop at a well, and the servant essentially says this classic prayer, Lord, show me a sign, in the form of the next woman who not only offers me a drink, but also my camels a drink. She's the one. She's the one. So here comes Rebekah, and sure enough, she fulfills the servant's prayer by offering him a drink and also his camels. And the servant gives her new fancy jewelry and asks about her family, and she invites him to stay at their house. The servant also puts it together that they're related to Abraham. What are the chances? So Rebekah runs to her mother's house and reported the whole story, and her brother Laban, after seeing the new fancy jewelry that Rebekah was wearing, ran out to meet the servant. And they are invited in with great hospitality, and then the servant recounts the whole story to Rebekah's brother Laban. And so this is where our text is picking up from today. So the servant said, I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has greatly blessed my master, and he has become wealthy. He has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male and female slaves, camels and donkeys. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and he has given him all that he has. My master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land I live, but you shall go to my father's house, to my kindred, and get a wife for my son. I came today to the spring and said, O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, if now you will only make successful the way I am going. I'm standing here by the spring of water. Let the young woman who comes out to draw, to whom I shall say, please give me a little water from your jar to drink, and who will say to me, drink, and I will draw for your camels also. Let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son. Before I finished speaking in my heart, there was Rebekah coming out with her water jar on her shoulder, and she went down to the spring and drew, and I said to her, please let me drink. She quickly let down her jar from her shoulder and said, drink, and I will also water your camels. So I drank, and she also watered the camels. Then I asked her, whose daughter are you? She said, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him. That's how we all introduce ourselves, right? So I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her arms, and I bowed my head and worshiped the Lord and blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had led me by the right way to obtain the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. Now then, if you will deal loyally and truly with my master, tell me. And if not, tell me, so that I may turn either to the right hand or to the left. And they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? She said, I will. So they sent away their sister Rebekah and her nurse, along with Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, may you, our sister, become thousands of myriads. May your offspring gain possession of the gates of their foes. Then Rebekah and her maids rose up, mounted the camels, and followed the man. Thus the servant took Rebekah and went his way. Now Isaac had come from Be'er Lahai-roi and was settled in the Negeb. Isaac went out in the evening to walk in the field. And looking up, he saw camels coming. And Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly from the camel and said to the servant, who is the man over there walking in the field to meet us? The servant said, it is my master. So she took her veil and covered herself. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. He took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death, and they all lived happily ever after. No, they did not. We know the story keeps going, but still, this is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So, considering that the past few weeks, the biblical stories have been rather harrowing, it's nice to have a bit of a respite in a love story. And this story, while it has some humor and some drama, is rather tame in that there is no great moral conflict or epically disturbing call from God. In fact, we don't hear God's voice at all in this text, which is curious considering it's the longest chapter in Genesis. So we're going to move through this in a few different themes. The first theme is the well. So we have this biblical meet cute of the couple meeting at a well. Now, I know that technically it was the servant and Rebekah at the well, But this narrative has all the same imagery as Jacob and Rachel, who met at a well, as Moses and Zipporah, who met at a well. And then, of course, if we fast forward to John 4 in the New Testament, Jesus meets a Samaritan woman at a well. And we know that that encounter harkens back to these well meet cutes. So there's a lot written about this biblical theme, this recurring meet cute. So at a basic level, the man meets woman at well pattern tells a story of an interaction, a bond between two parties. And it's a dramatic telling of the coming together of these two people who don't know each other. And not only that, but these well-meeting stories focus on the nation's leaders. Through their similarities, the similarities of these different stories, they connect the figures to one another by the same historical and theological thread. In other words, like Isaac and Rebekah, so also Jacob and then Moses will lead the nation in their covenant relationship. And then we'll see in the New Testament that a new covenant relationship is formed with Jesus. The second theme is a little bit more subtle because it has to do with a Hebrew word that we hear repeatedly through this text. The word is hesed. It's this beautiful word that means loving kindness or mercy, favor, even beauty. God does not intervene in any obvious way in this domestic tale. And yet the Lord, the God of Abraham, is invoked by Abraham himself, by this unnamed servant, and by Rebekah's family. God's will is discerned in prayer and by observation, and God's hesed, this steadfast love, this covenant loyalty, is demonstrated through human action. So hesed shows up 4 times in this chapter. It shows up in verse 12 when the servant prays to God that he's able to show hesed to his master, that the servant is able to show hesed to Abraham through the success of finding Isaac a wife. He's been given a very big task, and he is taking it very seriously, as he should. In verse 14, the servant makes reference to his "show me a sign" prayer, praying that God will show hesed to Abraham through the success of the servant. So through my success, God will show Abraham this hesed, this loyalty, this loving kindness. In verse 27, the servant is praising God for showing hesed after the servant has met Rebekah. Like, yay, God's hesed is revealed, yeah. And then in verse 49, the servant is asking Laban to show him hesed in telling him whether or not Rebekah can go with him. It's essentially you have all the information, what's your decision? Show me hesed by letting me know. And sometimes this hesed, this steadfast loyalty, this loving kindness, is used in reference to how people can treat each other, and sometimes it's in reference to how God treats us. So it can go both ways. And in our story for today, we can see how loving kindness, how hesed, is interwoven through the narrative. There is hesed between Abraham and his oldest servant, and the sincere desire that the servant has to succeed. There is the hesed between Rebekah and her family, which I think is shown most strongly, and that they ask for her consent to go with this stranger to a strange land to marry a man she's never met. They value her consent, and they show her hesed in that way. And then there is the hesed, the love between Isaac and Rebekah. God's hesed for humankind is shown through this marriage of Isaac and Rebekah, through the providence of continuing the family line. Sarah didn't live to see her son marry, didn't live to see Isaac have children with Rebekah, but we know that God keeps the generational promise through this union, and that loving kindness is poured out. And that leads us to this final theme, which is God's providence. We may not hear God's voice directly in this narrative, but through this love story, we see the hidden hand of God's providence, which we all hope and believe is active in our lives today, even if 9 times out of 10 we recognize it best only in retrospect. We laughed about this at Young Adult Bible Study earlier this week, about how this servant's prayer is the opposite of a prayer that we would encourage anyone to offer. We all wish our lives unfolded as clear-cut as someone saying, "Dear God, make the person I am looking for do exactly X, Y, Z," and then voila, someone does exactly that before our very eyes. Mostly, God's directing of our own lives is a bit more subtle. Still, we believe that God's providence is there. And I gotta say, I am so guilty of this myself, and it totally worked. I was 17 and trying to figure out which college to attend, and I only applied and got into 2 schools, one in Austin and one north of Chicago. I visited both, and they were both going to be viable options. I'd get a great education and have a great experience either way. But as I prayed to God about this fork in the road, I totally offered up a version of the servant's prayer. God, show me a sign. Let me know which school to pick. Even though in my head I was like, this prayer is so dumb, but also I just really need something obvious. I'm feeling a little desperate here. So God, help me out. Show me something obvious. And obvious I got. Now, this is obvious to me, perhaps not obvious to you, but let me tell you what happened. So, I got to Lake Forest, and the young women that I stayed with had NSYNC posters on their wall. Now, how's that for a sign? NSYNC was my favorite band at the time. You can see that, right? That makes sense. We totally bonded over that. NSYNC is a boy band, if you don't know who they are, that was popular 25 years ago. Okay, cool. And then we walked into town to rent a movie at Blockbuster. Remember when that was a thing? And we rented my favorite movie of all time, Almost Famous, still my favorite movie of all time. Then we walked down to the lakefront and sat on the rocks watching the moon rise. And I knew those were my signs. And I went to Lake Forest College and I had an amazing experience. Granted, I didn't ask for anything specific like the servant did. And of course, we can argue that, maybe I secretly wanted that school all along. But still, I have been in the shoes of that servant. I have asked for that prayer. And I felt like my prayer was answered. So as much as we can laugh about the servant's desperate prayer, haven't we all been there? And perhaps we don't hear the answer that we want, or we don't hear an answer at all. But the point is that we live trusting God's providence, which we hope and maybe even believe is active in our lives today. I also like the idea of God, the matchmaker, offered by Pastor Diane Roth. She says, what if all God does every day is make matches? What if that is, in fact, the only way that God transforms the world? Through matchmaking, which is to say, through human relationships. Since creation, God has been arranging meetings, putting people together, not just so that they'll have a nice life, but for larger, mysterious purposes, for the flourishing of the world and the advancement of God's purposes in the world. Our lives and our loves are holy and the holy product of a loving God. If we take God seriously as a matchmaker, it means that we each in our own way contribute to the coming of God's reign. It is embodied in us and in our children and in our children's children to the 1,000th generation. And so in this love story, with this biblical meet cute, we see not only these biblical themes recurring, but we also see how God works even when we don't necessarily hear God's voice. This hesed, this loving kindness, is poured out for us. And the hidden hand of God's providence is at work for us, meeting us where we are, even today. And as Christians, in our baptism, we are claimed as God's own, and a match is made between God and us for the sake of the world. Thanks be to God for a love like that. Amen.